Arah pressed herself against the cold concrete wall of the underground chamber, listening intently to the voices filtering down from above. The interrogation was taking place directly overhead, and she could make out Commander Harrison's measured responses to increasingly aggressive questioning. His voice sounded strained but defiant, which told her he was still fighting and hadn't broken under pressure. The found Sarah and Harrison moved through the corridors with practiced stealth, their footsteps silent on the worn wooden floors. The confusion from the earlier explosion was beginning to settle, but search teams were still moving throughout the compound, providing cover for their movement. They reached a junction where their paths would diverge, Harrison heading toward the eastern perimeter while Sarah turned toward the heavily defended main building. 20 minutes, Harrison whispered, checking his watch one final time. Sarah nodded and disappeared around the corner, leaving Harrison to make his way toward the vehicle depot alone. She moved quickly but carefully, using the maintenance buildings as cover while observing the main structure ahead. The building was 3 stories tall and clearly served as the compound's command center, with multiple radio antennas and communication equipment visible on the roof. The ground floor showed signs of significant activity, with guards moving in and out through several entrances. Sarah could see that accessing the building through conventional means would be impossible without engaging multiple hostiles. She needed another approach, something that would get her to the second floor without alerting the entire facility. Studying the building's exterior, Sarah noticed a series of utility pipes running up the western wall. They appeared to service the building's plumbing and electrical systems, providing potential handholds for climbing. More importantly, there was a window on the second floor that seemed to be partially open, possibly for ventilation. Sarah waited for a patrol to pass, then sprinted across the open ground to the base of the main building. The utility pipes were sturdy enough to support her weight, but the climb was treacherous. The metal was slick with condensation, and she had to move slowly to avoid making noise that might alert guards inside the building. Halfway up the wall, Sarah heard voices directly below her. 2 guards had stopped near the building's entrance, apparently discussing the explosion and its implications. One of them was looking around suspiciously, as if he sensed something wasn't right. Sarah pressed herself against the wall and remained perfectly still until they moved on. The second-floor window was indeed open, though only by a few inches. Sarah carefully worked her fingers under the frame and lifted slowly, praying the hinges wouldn't squeak. The window opened smoothly, allowing her to slip inside what appeared to be an empty office. The room was furnished with a desk, filing cabinets, and military maps mounted on the walls. Sarah quickly searched the desk drawers, but found only routine administrative documents. The maps showed regional terrain but didn't contain the operational intelligence Harrison had mentioned. She would have to search other offices on this floor. Moving to the door, Sarah listened carefully for activity in the hallway beyond. She could hear distant voices and footsteps, but the immediate area seemed clear. The hallway was longer than she had expected, with at least 6 doors leading to various offices and meeting rooms. The first office contained communication equipment and technical manuals. The second held personnel records and administrative files. Sarah was beginning to worry about time when she reached the third office and found what she was looking for. The room was clearly used by senior leadership, with expensive furniture and detailed maps covering multiple walls. But, more importantly, there was a large safe in one corner and several document folders marked with security classifications spread across the main desk. Someone had been working here recently and hadn't finished securing the sensitive materials. Sarah quickly photographed the documents with her phone, recognizing immediately that Harrison's intelligence had been accurate. The papers detailed a coordinated attack plan targeting 3 schools and 2 hospitals in the region's largest city. The operation was scheduled to begin in less than 48 hours, with multiple teams already in position. The scope of the planned attack was staggering. The terrorists intended to strike all 5 targets simultaneously, causing maximum casualties and overwhelming the local emergency response capabilities. Sarah could see that months of planning had gone into the operation, with detailed floor plans, security assessments, and timing schedules all meticulously prepared. As she continued documenting the intelligence, Sarah heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Someone was checking offices systematically, getting closer to her location with each passing moment. She quickly gathered the most critical documents, stuffed them inside her vest, and looked for an alternative exit. The office's window faced the compound's interior courtyard, where she could see increased security activity. Guards were setting up additional checkpoints and search positions, suggesting they had realized intruders were present in the facility. Escaping through the window would put her directly in their line of sight. The footsteps stopped outside the office door. Sarah heard the handle turning slowly and realized she was out of time. She positioned herself behind the door as it opened, weapon ready but hoping to avoid a confrontation that would alert the entire building to her presence. A guard entered the room cautiously, clearly sensing something was wrong. He noticed immediately that the documents on the desk had been disturbed and began reaching for his radio. Sarah struck quickly, subduing him before he could raise an alarm, but she knew his absence would be noticed soon. The captured guard's radio crackled with status requests from other search teams. Sarah realized she had maybe 5 minutes before his failure to respond would trigger a building-wide alert. She needed to reach the extraction point immediately, but she was still trapped on the second floor of a heavily guarded building. Studying the office layout more carefully, Sarah noticed a ventilation grate near the ceiling that appeared large enough for a person to crawl through. The ductwork might provide a way to move through the building without using the corridors. She climbed onto the desk and carefully removed the grate, testing the ductwork's structural integrity. The metal ducts were sturdy enough to support her weight, though the space was cramped and uncomfortable. Sarah pulled herself into the ventilation system and replaced the grate behind her, hoping to delay discovery of her route. The ducts ran throughout the building, with junction points that allowed her to navigate toward what she hoped was an external exit. Crawling through the ductwork was slow and noisy, despite her efforts to move quietly. The metal amplified every sound, and she could hear her movement echoing through the system. Worse, she could hear voices from rooms below as guards searched for the missing sentry. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, Sarah reached a junction where she could see daylight filtering through an external vent. The opening was on the building's rear wall, away from the main security positions. She carefully removed the external grate and lowered herself to the ground. The vehicle depot was approximately 200 meters away, across an area that provided minimal cover. Sarah could see Harrison's position near the motor pool, where he appeared to be preparing one of the trucks for their escape. Several guards were visible around the depot, but they seemed focused on routine security rather than active searching. Sarah checked her watch. She had used 17 of her allotted 20 minutes, leaving very little time to reach the extraction point. She would have to cross the open ground quickly, relying on speed rather than stealth to avoid detection. Taking a deep breath, Sarah sprinted toward the depot. She had covered about half the distance when shouts erupted behind her. The missing guard had been discovered, and security teams were pouring out of the main building. Spotlight beams swept across the compound as guards tried to locate the intruders. Harrison saw her approach and immediately started the truck's engine. The vehicle was a military transport with armored plating, capable of breaking through the compound's perimeter fence if necessary. As Sarah reached the depot, Harrison threw open the passenger door and provided covering fire as she climbed inside. "Did you get it?" he asked urgently while maneuvering the truck toward the compound's exit. "Everything," Sarah replied, pulling the documents from her vest. "Schools and hospitals. Attack begins tomorrow night." Harrison's expression hardened as he absorbed the implications. They had the intelligence needed to prevent a massacre, but they still needed to survive long enough to deliver it. The truck accelerated toward the compound's main gate, where guards were frantically trying to close the heavy barriers. The perimeter fence was designed to keep vehicles in as much as to keep intruders out. Harrison aimed the truck at the reinforced gate, knowing they would have only one chance to break through before defensive positions could bring concentrated fire on their vehicle. The impact was tremendous, throwing both Sarah and Harrison against their restraints as the truck smashed through the gate and onto the road beyond. The vehicle's armor protected them from immediate gunfire, but Sarah could see pursuit vehicles beginning to mobilize behind them. Harrison pushed the truck to its maximum speed along the mountain road. taking advantage of his familiarity with the terrain to maintain their lead. Sarah used the radio to contact their support team, requesting immediate evacuation and air support to cover their withdrawal. Falcon Base, this is Ghost. Package recovered with critical intelligence. Request immediate extraction at Rally Point Alpha. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the static. Ghost, we have helicopters inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Can you hold that long? Sarah looked behind them at the growing cloud of dust from pursuing vehicles. We'll make it work. The next 10 minutes were a harrowing chase through mountain roads, with Harrison using every defensive driving technique he knew to stay ahead of their pursuers. Sarah provided covering fire when enemy vehicles got close enough, her accurate shooting discouraging attempts to overtake their position. As they approached the designated rally point, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of military helicopters approaching from the south. The extraction birds came in low and fast, their door gunners providing suppressive fire that scattered the pursuit vehicles. The truck skidded to a stop in the designated landing zone as the first helicopter touched down. Sarah and Harrison transferred quickly to the aircraft, along with the critical intelligence that would prevent hundreds of civilian casualties. As the helicopter climbed away from the landing zone, Sarah looked back at the compound where she had begun this mission alone. The rescue had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, not only freeing Commander Harrison, but also uncovering intelligence that would save countless innocent lives. Harrison sat beside her in the helicopter, studying the captured documents with growing amazement. Captain, this intelligence is going to prevent a catastrophe. How did you know to look for operational plans? I didn't, sir. I was just following your lead. Harrison shook his head in admiration. No, Captain. You made the decision to go in alone when everyone else said it was impossible. You made the choice to risk the secondary mission when extraction was already assured. Those were leadership decisions, and they were the right ones. As the helicopter carried them towards safety, Sarah reflected on the mission's unlikely success. She had begun the day as a captain following orders, and ended it as someone who had prevented a terrorist attack through her own initiative and courage. The experience had changed her understanding of what leadership meant and what individuals could accomplish when they were willing to risk everything for others. The intelligence they had gathered would be transmitted immediately to counter-terrorism units in the region, allowing them to intercept the terrorist teams before they could reach their targets. The schools and hospital station chamber was larger than she had expected, with multiple support pillars creating natural hiding spots. Dim light filtered through small ventilation grates near the ceiling, providing just enough illumination to navigate without using her flashlight. Sarah could see that the space had been modified over the years, with electrical cables and water pipes running along the walls to supply the building above. Moving carefully between the pillars, Sarah approached the stairs she had spotted earlier. The wooden steps looked old but solid, and they led up to what appeared to be a heavy wooden door. She tested the first step gingerly, relieved when it supported her weight without creaking. The years of moisture had actually helped, swelling the wood and eliminating most of the squeaks that might have given her away. Halfway up the stairs, Sarah paused as she heard new voices joining the interrogation. Someone was giving orders in a language she didn't recognize, but the tone was clearly authoritative. The questioning stopped momentarily, replaced by what sounded like a heated discussion among the interrogators. This might be her opportunity to get closer and assess the situation. The door at the top of the stairs was slightly ajar, providing Sarah with a narrow view into the building's ground floor. She could see a long corridor with several doors leading off to rooms on either side. The voices were coming from somewhere to her left, probably 2 or 3 rooms away based on the sound clarity. Sarah eased the door open just wide enough to slip through, finding herself in what appeared to be a maintenance corridor. The walls were lined with utility pipes and electrical panels, suggesting this area was primarily functional rather than living space. More importantly, the corridors seemed to be unoccupied at the moment. She moved along the wall, pausing at each doorway to listen and observe. The first room contained supplies and equipment, stacks of boxes, and military gear arranged in organized rows. The second room was empty except for some furniture covered with dust sheets. It was in the third room that she found what she was looking for. Through a partially open door, Sarah could see Commander Harrison sitting in a wooden chair in the center of a small room. His hands were bound behind him, and his uniform was torn and dirty, but he appeared to be uninjured. 3 men stood around him, 2 in military fatigues and 1 in civilian clothes who seemed to be leading the questioning. The civilian was middle-aged with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He spoke in accented English, occasionally switching to another language when addressing his subordinates. From his questions, it was clear he was trying to extract information about troop movements and supply routes in the region. Harrison was giving only his name, rank, and identification number, exactly as military protocol required. The interrogator's frustration was becoming evident as he paced around the room, gesturing emphatically while demanding more detailed responses. Sarah could see that the situation was escalating and might turn violent soon. She retreated slightly to consider her options. 3 armed men in a confined space presented a significant challenge, especially since she needed to ensure Harrison's safety during any action she took. The room had only one visible entrance, which meant she would have to go through all 3 guards to reach the commander. Sarah remembered the explosive charge Chun had given her and began formulating a plan. If she could create a distraction elsewhere in the building, it might draw some of the guards away from Harrison's room. The supply room she had passed earlier would be an ideal location for a diversion, as an explosion there would suggest an external attack rather than infiltration. Moving back down the corridor, Sarah slipped into the supply room and began examining the stored materials. She found several containers of fuel and what appeared to be ammunition boxes stacked against one wall. If properly placed, Chin's explosive could trigger a secondary reaction that would create significant noise and confusion. Sarah set the charge timer for 3 minutes, giving herself enough time to return to Harrison's location and prepare for action. She positioned the device near the fuel containers and activated the countdown, then hurried back to the interrogation room. The questioning was continuing, with the civilian interrogator becoming increasingly agitated. He had begun making threats about transferring Harrison to a location where the questioning would be more intensive. Sarah could see that Harrison understood the implications, but remained stoically silent. 2 minutes until detonation. Sarah checked her weapon and prepared to move. Her plan was simple but risky. When the explosion occurred, she would enter the room during the initial confusion and neutralize any guards who didn't leave to investigate the distraction. If everything went wrong, she at least had the element of surprise on her side. 1 minute remaining. The interrogator had stepped away from Harrison and was consulting with one of his subordinates in whispered conversation. Sarah could see they were discussing something important, possibly the prisoner transfer Harrison had mentioned in his threats. The explosion, when it came, was louder than Sarah had expected. The entire building shook, and she could hear shouts and running footsteps from multiple directions. As she had hoped, 2 of the guards immediately left Harrison's room to investigate, leaving only the civilian interrogator behind. Sarah moved quickly through the doorway, her weapon raised. The interrogator spun around in surprise, reaching for a pistol on the nearby table, but Sarah was faster. "Don't move," she commanded in a low voice. "Step away from the weapon." The man's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. He raised his hands slowly, backing away from the table while studying Sarah's face. She could see him calculating his options, looking for any opportunity to turn the situation to his advantage. "You're making a serious mistake," he said in careful English. "This facility is heavily guarded. Even if you free your commander, you'll never make it out alive." Sarah ignored his words, moving to cut Harrison's restraints while keeping her weapon trained on the interrogator. As soon as his hands were free, Harrison rubbed his wrists to restore circulation and looked up at Sarah with a mixture of relief and concern. "Captain Mitchell," he said quietly, "I assume you have an extraction plan." "Working on it, sir," Sarah replied, helping Harrison to his feet. She could hear voices and footsteps in the corridor outside, growing closer as the guards searched for the source of the explosion. Harrison tested his legs, which were stiff from being bound for hours. "How many personnel did you bring for this operation?" "Just me, sir." Harrison stared at her in disbelief. "You came in here alone?" Before Sarah could respond, they heard voices directly outside the room. The guards were returning, probably having determined that the explosion was sabotage rather than an external attack. Sarah positioned herself near the doorway while Harrison took cover behind the overturned table. The first guard through the door walked directly into Sarah's ambush. She struck him with the butt of her weapon, and he collapsed unconscious. The second guard was more cautious, using the doorframe for cover while trying to locate targets in the room. Harrison, despite his recent captivity, still retained his combat instincts. While the guard was focused on Sarah's position, Harrison moved silently around the room's perimeter. He struck the guard from behind, disarming him efficiently and securing his weapon. "We need to move," Sarah said urgently. "The explosion will have alerted the entire compound." Harrison nodded, checking the captured guard's ammunition and equipment. "What's your extraction route?" Sarah explained about the drainage tunnel, describing the underground chamber and the route she had taken to reach the building. Harrison listened carefully, his expression growing more concerned as she detailed the confined spaces and limited exit options. "That tunnel won't support two people moving quickly," he observed. "If they discover our escape route, we'll be trapped underground." "Do you have a better idea, sir?" Harrison moved to the window and carefully observed the compound layout. The explosion had created significant activity, with guards moving between buildings and searching for threats. However, he could also see that the perimeter defenses remained fully manned. "There's a vehicle depot on the eastern side of the compound," Harrison said. "I observed it during my initial capture. If we could reach one of the trucks, we might be able to breach the perimeter fence and escape before they can organize an effective pursuit." Sarah considered this alternative. It would require crossing open ground and fighting through multiple defensive positions, but it also offered the possibility of a fast extraction once they reached the vehicles. The drainage tunnel, while safer initially, would be a death trap if discovered. "How do we reach the depot without being detected?" Sarah asked. Harrison pointed to a series of maintenance buildings that formed a rough line between their current position and the vehicle area. "If we move between those structures during the confusion, we might be able to get close enough to make a run for it." They could hear more guards approaching the building, along with what sounded like search dogs. Time was running out quickly, and they needed to make a decision. Sarah looked out the window at the compound, calculating distances and sight lines. "The maintenance route looks possible," she agreed. "But we'll need a bigger distraction to cover our movement." Harrison smiled grimly. "I noticed several fuel barrels near the main building during my arrival. If we could trigger an explosion there, it would draw attention away from the vehicle depot." Sarah checked her remaining equipment. She still had her radio, which could potentially be used as a remote detonator if they could improvise an explosive device. The fuel barrels Harrison had mentioned would provide the secondary explosion they needed. "I can rig something," she said. "But we'll only get one chance at this." They began moving toward the room's exit, but Harrison suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm. "Captain, before we proceed, I need to tell you something. During the interrogation, I learned that this compound is not what intelligence believed. They're planning a major operation against civilian targets, and the information is stored in the main building." Sarah felt her stomach drop. If Harrison was right, their escape would allow a significant terrorist operation to proceed. But attempting to gather intelligence would drastically reduce their chances of successful extraction. "Sir, we don't have the resources to conduct a secondary mission." "I understand," Harrison replied. "But the intelligence indicates attacks on schools and hospitals. We're talking about hundreds of civilian casualties." Sarah stared at him, understanding the impossible choice he was presenting. They could focus on escape and survival, or they could risk everything to prevent a catastrophic attack on innocent people. It was exactly the kind of decision that separated good soldiers from great ones, and she knew Harrison would never forgive himself if they had the chance to prevent mass casualties, but chose not to act. "Where is the information stored?" she asked quietly. Harrison's expression showed both relief and apprehension. "Main building, second floor. The interrogator mentioned it was in a secured office, but I don't know the exact location." Sarah looked out the window again, reassessing their tactical situation. The main building was heavily guarded and located on the opposite side of the compound from both the vehicle depot and her drainage tunnel. Reaching it would require crossing the most defended area of the facility. "We'll need to split up," she decided. You head for the vehicle depot and prepare for extraction. I'll attempt to reach the main building and gather the intelligence." "Absolutely not," Harrison said firmly. "We go together or not at all." "Sir, with respect, that's not tactically sound. One person has a better chance of infiltrating the main building undetected. If I can retrieve the intelligence and create enough chaos, you can pick me up at the depot during the confusion." Harrison considered this plan, weighing the risks and potential benefits. Sarah could see him struggling with the decision to send a subordinate into extreme danger while he took the safer role. But she also knew he understood that her smaller size and infiltration skills made her better suited for the intelligence-gathering mission. "How long do you need?" he asked finally. 20 minutes maximum. If I'm not at the depot by then, proceed with extraction and report what we've learned." They synchronized their watches and prepared to separate. Sarah gave Harrison her spare ammunition and took only essential gear for her infiltration attempt. As they prepared to leave the room, they could hear search teams getting closer to their location. "Captain," Harrison said quietly, "that was impressive work getting in here. Whatever happens next, you've already succeeded." Sarah nodded acknowledgement and moved toward the door. The hardest part of the mission was just beginning, but at least now she had a chance to prevent something much worse than the capture of a single commander. The intelligence Harrison had learned could save hundreds of lives, making the risk worthwhile regardless of the outcome. As they prepared to split up and execute their desperate plan, Sarah took one last look around the room where she had found her commander. In a few hours, this place would either be the site of their greatest success or their final stand. Either way, they would face it knowing they had tried to do the right thing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her tactical vest one final time. The intelligence report crackled through her radio with devastating clarity. Commander James Harrison, her mentor and the man who had trained half the Special Forces unit, had been captured during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission near the border. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she studied the satellite images spread across the makeshift command table. The enemy stronghold sat like a fortress carved into the mountainside, surrounded by watchtowers and razor wire. Every entrance was monitored, every approach covered by sniper positions. It was a place designed to keep people out and prisoners in. "We need to wait for backup," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with concern. "The nearest support team is 6 hours out. We can't risk losing more people." Sarah knew he was right from a tactical standpoint. Standard protocol demanded they wait for reinforcements before attempting any rescue operation. But she also knew that Commander Harrison had maybe 12 hours before the enemy would either move him to a more secure location or worse. The intelligence network had intercepted communications suggesting an imminent prisoner transfer at dawn. The captured commander wasn't just any soldier. Harrison had spent 15 years building relationships with local tribal leaders, gathering intelligence that had prevented countless attacks on civilian populations. His knowledge of regional operations made him an invaluable asset to friendly forces and an equally valuable target for the enemy. If they managed to extract information from him, it could compromise years of careful intelligence work and put hundreds of lives at risk. Sarah remembered the day Harrison had pulled her aside during training. She had been struggling with a particularly difficult infiltration exercise, frustrated by her repeated failures to breach the mock compound undetected. Instead of criticism, he had sat down beside her in the dirt and shared a story about his own early failures. "The best soldiers aren't the ones who never fall," he had said. "They're the ones who learn to fall quietly." That lesson had shaped her approach to every mission since. Sarah had developed a reputation for creative solutions and unconventional tactics. While other soldiers relied on overwhelming firepower, she preferred stealth and precision. Her small frame and quick thinking had gotten her out of impossible situations before, earning her the nickname Ghost among her unit. Now, as she stared at the aerial photographs of the enemy compound, Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The main entrance was heavily fortified, with at least 12 guards visible in the daytime photos. The rear approach led through a minefield that intelligence had mapped, but couldn't guarantee was complete. The eastern wall bordered a steep cliff that dropped into a river valley below. But there was something else. In one corner of the satellite image, partially hidden by shadows, Sarah could make out what appeared to be a drainage tunnel. It was small, probably designed for runoff during the rainy season, and it seemed to lead from outside the compound to somewhere near the main building. The tunnel was narrow, maybe just wide enough for a person to crawl through, and there was no way to know if it was guarded or blocked. Rodriguez continued studying the tactical situation with growing pessimism. Even if we could get inside, we don't know where they're holding him. The compound has at least 3 buildings large enough to contain holding cells. We'd be searching blind while under fire. Sarah nodded absently, her attention focused on the tunnel entrance. She had spent summers as a child exploring caves in the mountains near her family's ranch. Tight spaces had never bothered her, and she had an intuitive sense for underground navigation. If the tunnel was passable, it might be her only chance to reach Harrison before the transfer. The radio crackled again with an update from headquarters. Falcon Base, this is command. Backup ETA is now 8 hours due to mechanical issues with transport. Maintain surveillance, and do not attempt rescue until support arrives. Acknowledge. Rodriguez reached for the radio, but Sarah caught his wrist. She looked around at her small team. Besides Rodriguez, she had Sergeant Chun, a demolitions expert with steady hands and unshakable calm, and Corporal Washington, whose marksmanship had saved their lives more than once during previous operations. They were good soldiers, but this mission would require more than skill. It would require someone willing to risk everything. If we wait 8 hours, Harrison will be gone, Sarah said quietly. You know it, and I know it. Chin spoke up from where he was cleaning his rifle. Captain, the math doesn't work. For people against an estimated 40 defenders, with unknown civilian populations in the area, even if we could reach the commander, extraction would be nearly impossible. Sarah understood their reasoning, but she also understood something they might not fully grasp. Harrison had saved her career and possibly her life during a mission 2 years earlier. When her squad had been pinned down by enemy fire in an urban environment, Harrison had personally led a rescue operation through hostile territory. He had risked court-martial charges by disobeying direct orders to wait for air support that might have come too late. More importantly, Sarah had noticed something in the satellite images that others had missed. The compound's design suggested it had been built around existing structures, possibly an old monastery or government building. Such buildings typically had multiple levels, including basement areas that might not be visible from aerial surveillance. If Harrison was being held underground, conventional assault tactics would be useless anyway. Washington finished checking his equipment and looked up at Sarah. Ma'am, what are you thinking? Sarah pointed to the drainage tunnel on the photograph. Single infiltrator, minimal equipment, in and out before they know anyone was there. No backup needed if it's done right. And if it's not done right? Rodriguez asked. Then, you follow protocol and wait for support, Sarah replied. But at least we'll have tried. The team fell silent as they considered the implications. Sarah could see the internal struggle on their faces. They wanted to save their commander, but they also recognized the mission's extremely low probability of success. Military training emphasized calculated risks and measured responses, not desperate solo ventures into heavily defended enemy territory. Rodriguez broke the silence first. Captain, I can't authorize this mission. You're not authorizing it, Sarah said, beginning to strip unnecessary gear from her vest. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you that I'm going to scout the perimeter for intelligence-gathering purposes. If I happen to encounter the commander during my reconnaissance, I'll adapt accordingly. It was a thin legal distinction, but it provided Rodriguez with enough cover to avoid direct insubordination charges. Sarah was technically within her authority as the senior officer present to conduct reconnaissance operations. The fact that she intended to attempt a rescue was a decision she would make in the field based on developing circumstances. Chen handed her a small explosive charge. If you're really doing this, you'll want something to create a distraction during extraction. Washington contributed a suppressed pistol and extra ammunition. Low profile, but effective if things go wrong. Rodriguez reluctantly provided detailed timing information. Guard rotation happens every 4 hours. Next change is at 1,400 hours. That gives you maybe a 20-minute window when they'll be transitioning positions. Sarah tucked the items into her streamlined kit. She kept only essential gear: water, medical supplies, ammunition, the explosive charge, a compact radio, and a set of bolt cutters in case the tunnel was grated. Everything else would only slow her down in the confined space. As she prepared to leave, Sarah caught Rodriguez's arm. "If I'm not back in 6 hours, contact headquarters and request immediate air support for compound bombardment. Don't wait for me." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Understood, Captain." Sarah moved out from their concealed position as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. The approach to the tunnel entrance required crossing nearly 200 meters of open ground with minimal cover. She would have to time her movement carefully, using natural shadows and terrain features to avoid detection by the watchtower guards. The first 100 meters went smoothly. Sarah moved in short sprints between rocky outcroppings, pausing to observe guard patterns and radio communications. The enemy soldiers seemed relaxed, confident in their defensive positions. This worked in Sarah's favor, as alert guards would have spotted her movement much sooner. 50 meters from the tunnel entrance, Sarah encountered an unexpected obstacle. A patrol had taken position near a water source that lay directly in her planned route. Two soldiers sat smoking and talking in low voices, their weapons casually propped against nearby rocks. They showed no signs of moving anytime soon. Sarah checked her watch. The guard rotation would begin in 90 minutes, and she needed to be inside the tunnel system before then. Waiting for the patrol to leave would consume too much time, but attempting to bypass them would require crossing exposed ground in full view of the watchtowers. She studied the patrol's position more carefully and noticed something promising. The soldiers had chosen a spot that was shielded from the compound's line of sight by a large boulder. If she could neutralize them quietly, their absence might not be noticed until the next scheduled check-in. Sarah approached from downwind, moving with the patience her training had instilled. Each step was calculated to avoid loose rocks or vegetation that might rustle and give away her position. The afternoon breeze carried the sound of the soldiers' conversation, masking any minor noise she might make. When she was close enough to hear individual words, Sarah paused to listen for intelligence. The soldiers were discussing their evening plans and complaining about the quality of their rations. Nothing immediately useful, but their relaxed demeanor confirmed they weren't expecting any immediate threats. Sarah waited for the right moment, then moved swiftly and silently. Both soldiers were unconscious within seconds, secured with their own equipment, and hidden behind the boulder where they wouldn't be easily discovered. She took their radio to monitor enemy communications and continued toward the tunnel entrance. The drainage opening was exactly as it had appeared in the satellite images: narrow, partially concealed by vegetation, and apparently unguarded. Sarah tested the entrance carefully, checking for trip wires or other defensive measures. Finding none, she began the claustrophobic journey into the heart of the enemy compound. The tunnel was barely wide enough for her shoulders, forcing her to crawl on her belly while pushing her equipment ahead of her. The concrete walls were rough and stained with mineral deposits from years of water flow. In several places, roots from surface vegetation had broken through the ceiling, creating obstacles she had to navigate around. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, Sarah began to hear sounds from above. Footsteps, muffled voices, and the occasional slam of a door suggested she was passing beneath occupied areas of the compound. She paused periodically to listen, trying to determine the building's layout and identify where prisoners might be held. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber that appeared to be part of the building's foundation. Sarah could see stairs leading upward, and, more importantly, she could hear a voice she recognized. Commander Harrison was somewhere above her, and, from the sound of it, he was being interrogated. Sarah checked her equipment one final time and began planning her next move. The real mission was just beginning.